So now, for real, I'm going to ask Victoria to come up and join us as she does her talk today on the history of pride. So thank you, Victoria.
Hi. This was originally part of a 2-hour lecture, so you guys are getting the very much shortened version, which hopefully you'll enjoy. I do want to warn you that the history of pride is a history of power and resistance, but it's also a history of pain. And I'm taking you all the way back to the 20th century, early 20th century, to talk a little bit about what led up to pride. And in Canada, you have to remember that in the 1940s and 50s, being queer was illegal. It was illegal to be a man who loved a man. It was illegal to be someone who existed outside the gender binary. It was illegal to be queer, and people were arrested. They went to prison. And this doesn't mean queer people didn't exist, because as a historian, I can tell you, queer people have always existed in every capacity, in every place in the world. Unfortunately, many of them had to live very underground. They were unable to live to themselves out because it was illegal, and it was also so taboo to be openly queer. But we start to have, in the 1950s, a bit of a change. We start to see some people, such as we have Jim Egan, who's an activist I'm going to talk about, being born and brought into this world in Canada. But we also have some negative things happening. We have, unfortunately, the 1950s and 60s were a time of intense RCMP surveillance of queer people. And this is because, in particular, there was this idea during the Cold War that people who were queer, if they were in public service, if they were in the military, that they would be more easy to blackmail and then give up state secrets to the communists. So during the Cold War, the RCMP actually developed several things to surveil people who were in public service in the military to make sure they weren't queer. And this went really strangely. This was a time when we had what was called the Fruit machine being developed, which was literally a gay testing machine, which was when they would literally show you images of queerness and they'd test to make sure your pupils weren't showing that you were sexually attracted and there was no genital stimulation. Not okay to do. Very much not okay, but a lot of people actually lost their jobs because either they were queer or they were thought to be queer. And so they were removed from public service, removed from the military, all because they were seen as liabilities, as something beyond people because of what they were. And this was a very difficult time for a lot of people because they were very afraid. Obviously, you're afraid of losing your job, but also the public censure that would come with being outed as being a queer person. People, unfortunately, at this time, when they were outed, some of them took their own lives because they were unable to live with the shame that was surrounding them about the judgment they were getting from other people. And most of these people had done literally nothing wrong. They were just living their lives, and they were living their lives very quietly. There wasn't pride at this time. We did have the Kinsey report on sexuality that came out in the 1940s and 50s that said, actually, did you know that a large percentage of the population is actually gay? And people were like, oh my God, this is a copy. It became a best-selling book because people were shocked, but also so many people who were living their lives quietly or thinking there was something wrong with them were reading this book, buying this book and reading it and realizing it's not just me. It's not just me who has these feelings of love and attraction to someone. It's actually, at this point, they were like 10% of the population, and people were shocked. It's actually probably a lot more than that, and every study since then has shown. But if you're thinking 10% of the population when you did the survey in 1948, it's a lot of people. And so we're starting to see, unfortunately, a lot of repercussions coming as people start to be more open. In the 1960s, we start to see more people speaking up about being queer. And a lot of them were arrested, were harassed by the police, were kicked out of their churches, lost their jobs as teachers or as public servants. We also have, in the 1960s, Everett George Clippert, who is this amazing character in Canadian history. He was the last man arrested and imprisoned for being queer. He was arrested for having an intimate relationship with another man, and he was sentenced to a life in prison. And that's important to remember why so many people stayed in the closet was because there was repercussions that extended to your entire life. He was rejected by friends and family. And he represents this moment in Canadian history because things started to change after Everett's trial. Things started to change when we started to see the 1960s and leading into the 70s. Some of you were there, you might remember some of this. It was a little before me, but when we move into the 1960s, we get a new moment because Trudeau Sr., not Trudeau Jr., was elected, and he brought in a lot of changes. And the biggest one, for the sake of this talk, is Bill C-150. And it was brought in May 1969, and it decriminalized gay sex for the first time in Canadian history. Before this, it was literally illegal for queer people to express their love to each other. Doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it was illegal. And when this changed the law, this literally changed the law. And with Everett Clippard, who had just gone to prison for being a queer man who had an intimate relationship with another man, people were suddenly like, wait a minute. If this isn't illegal anymore, what do we do about this guy and all these other people who are in prison for being queer? And so I think some of you may remember Trudeau Sr. was like, whatever happens in the bedroom between consenting adults is their business. That was radical in a time when people were losing their jobs, were taking their lives because of the life they'd been living. And this really began what's known as the gay liberation movement in the 1970s in Canada. We know a lot of you have probably heard of the Stonewall riots in the States that happened in 1969. We didn't have Stonewall in Canada at the same time, but we have our own version that I'm going to talk about. In 1971, Everett Clippard was released from jail. We start getting publications. This is the Body Politic that I have pictured here, and it's the first Canadian big queer publication. And it's an amazing resource if you look into it. Super fun. I have access to archives if you're interested. But this was a movement that started with people publishing saying, I'm queer and this is my experience, out loud for the first time. And so in 1973, we actually have the Canadian Gay Liberation Movement archives are launched. And there's still, this has evolved and is still present in Canada today. The Toronto Queer Archives are still a place you can visit, they're being added to. But this was 1973. We're talking 3 years after being queer was made legal. This was massive movement for the time. And so we also have in this time homosexuality. Before this was viewed as a mental illness, which we know it's not. But in 1973, homosexuality was removed from what's the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual, which is the DSM. It's used for diagnosing mental illness, and homosexuality for the first time was removed from that as a mental illness. And that was a huge moment for a lot of people because so many people literally thought there was something wrong with them for loving who they loved, for being who they were. And by taking away some of this stigma, we start to see, again, more and more people. We even have a TV show in the 1970s called Coming Out, and it was Canada's first queer television show in the 1970s. Again, moments after it became legal just to exist, we have so many people speaking out about who they are and that they're proud of themselves. And so we even have in the 1970s, in the late 70s, the Canadian Immigration Act was modified so that people weren't banned from immigrating to Canada because they were queer, because that was illegal to do, to discriminate at this point because it's not legal to be gay. If you can be queer, you can come into this country because, again, this discrimination laws had all these repercussions where queer people were prevented from coming into the country if they were known to be queer. And so in 1979, we actually have our first Pride March. It happens in Montreal, in Canada, and it's a beautiful moment where a lot of people felt seen for the first time. But it is not the end of discrimination for queer people when we have our first Pride March. And it was actually just like it was just a few people, a couple banners. They had a picnic. They had a picnic. They were like, gay picnic, people come. And it was really small at first because so many people were closeted. So many people were still very afraid because even though things were changing, it was still very dangerous to be queer. And so then when we move into the 1980s and 90s, we get big movement, especially when we have, in 1981, Operation Soap, the Toronto bathhouse raids, which is not talked about a lot in Canadian history because we tend to look at American history and talk about Stonewall. In 1981, there were these queer bathhouses in Toronto. And if you know anything about queer culture, especially for gay men, bathhouses were a place they could congregate in private and meet other men who were also queer. So in 1981, 4 bathhouses in Toronto were raided by the Toronto police in what was called Operation Soap. And so they arrested almost 300 people for public lewdness. This was behind closed doors. This was people doing what they want to do in private. But it was what we call our Stonewall in Canada, because as a result of Operation Soap, the community mobilized. They protested the police conduct. They marched down the streets of Toronto yelling, "We are here, and we are not ashamed." And this really changed Toronto. This was a moment where we saw that the people would stand up against the prejudice that all these institutions had, that the police had, that the government had. And it was a moment of queer resistance. It was met with a lot of anger. The newspapers at the time were like, oh, these horrible people marching in the streets, disturbing the peace. But again, for so many queer people on the margins, they saw themselves being reflected, and they felt strength from seeing members of their community standing up against police violence. And so this has been a really important moment in Canadian queer history, because from then on, queer people have refused to be silenced in Toronto and in Canada more broadly. And this was also an interesting time. The AIDS epidemic was happening, people were dying, and it was adding to the stigma of being queer, because people thought, oh, queer people are dirty. That's not true. Obviously, we know that. We also have the case of Egan v. Canada happening in the 1980s. And this is when Jim Egan fought to have his relationship with his lifetime partner recognized by the Canadian state, because queer people were not allowed to get married. And so they couldn't share benefits. And we know how important benefits are. And so Jim Egan fought the Canadian government because he said, I want my partner on my benefits so he can get cancer treatment. We've lived together, we've loved each other for 30 years. For straight passing people, they can share their benefits with each other. Why can't we? And so Egan took this to the Supreme Court, and he lost. He lost that case. His marriage, because it was not legal, did not count. But he didn't give up, and we know we have queer marriage today. His fight, though, again, brought to the surface the fact that so many people had seen queer people as others. And when he was talking about his relationship with the love of his life, so many people looked and said, oh, these are just people. And so this is all the things that really led up to Pride becoming what it is today. We have human rights law in Canada changing in the 1990s. We have people recognizing that sexuality and gender need to be protected under our human rights legislation in Canada, which they are today. That was a long fight. And that was a fight that the people who were fighting against the discrimination of the bathhouse raids were fighting for up to today. And that's the other thing, is like sometimes we think about history as being that long ago. These people are still around. Like, these people are still alive. They're among us. And so I've got my last slide here, or my second to last slide here. I got excited. I'm going to shorten this. Sorry. If we go to the next slide, it says Pride in Toronto. This is a picture of the very first Pride in Toronto. So like I said, it started out as like a picnic, but also just so like, we're here, also come talk to us. See, we're people. Like, it was really this moment of liberation for so many, because they saw themselves being reflected in the community among them. And for the first time, people were seeing that this didn't have to be something that was so hidden behind closed doors, because it's just people living their lives. And if we go to the final slide in this, these are some of the early advertisements they put out to advertise for the first iterations of Pride. And this is important to remember. We tend to think, especially of the 2000s up to today, as being a time where queer people have been safe. I think the general public thinks that a lot. That's not always been true. Even into the year 2000, there was a lesbian bar in Toronto that was raided by a bunch of cops, and a bunch of queer women were arrested for, again, lewd behavior. Again, behind closed doors, consenting adults. None of the cops' business. And you know what the queer women did as a result? They marched in the streets again in 2000 against the discrimination, because even within the LGBTQIA plus community, there's still a lot of bias, because we know that queer gay men, who are white in particular, are more accepted than queer women, especially queer women of color. And so there's still a lot of fights to be had, and we're still fighting for trans rights today. But this is the past that we want to celebrate. We want to celebrate our future, but we cannot forget the pain that came before it. Thank you.